Winter, war, wolves, and fire. Ragnarok is the finale to Norse myth, but there is an epilogue. Something that may stick out about Ragnarok that isn't found in other apocalypse myths is the utter hopelessness of it all. I mean, the apocalypse is usually pretty hopeless, but follow me on this. Ragnarok is foretold and fated, but it isn't the righteous end to an unrighteous war. There is no justice for the good, and by the end of the long winters, there is no virtuous few remaining. All men have turned to violence. But after Ragnarok, we may find some version of this. Depending on the text, there may be some places that survive Surt's fire. The giant Brimir has a hall in Oaklanir that is translated as never cold. Here, the good mead will flow, and those who like a good drink will find a resting place. Then there is the red and gold hall of the dwarf Sindri in the dark mountains. This will be a resting place for good and virtuous men. On the opposite end of things, there stands a hall for oath breakers and evildoers, Nastrandir, or corpse stranding. There, the hall is made out of snake bones, and a river of venom runs through it. The serpent who writhed at the roots of the world tree, Nidhogg, will go north to gnaw on the bones of the dead there. All these places are described in both the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda. But in the Poetic Edda, in the seeress's prophecy, they are described before the events of Ragnarok take place, so there's a good question of whether they survived. Snorri Sturluson, who wrote the Prose Edda, describes these places as existing after Ragnarok, but he had to make concessions to a religious audience when he wrote the Prose Edda. So is this just some form of heaven and hell? A good example of this is Gimli, a golden place, the best place to live. It's described by Snorri as simply heaven, but we get a more apt description in the Poetic Edda. It's a place where noble fighting bands will dwell and enjoy the days of their lives in pleasure. So there is some vague form of reward and punishment. The question just is, does it take place before or after Ragnarok? Now, all these locations are outside of Midgard, but Midgard itself does return. She sees, coming up a second time, Earth from the ocean, eternally green. And just as Midgard returns, so will humanity. Two humans will appear, a man and a woman, at Hodmimir's woods, having hidden in an ash tree. Coming out of the tree recalls the creation of humans in Norse myth from wood, but it also provides a convenient hook for Christians to find their way into Norse tradition. But what about the gods? Well, those who fell on Vigrid don't come back. But we do see the return of Baldr, the god whose death started all of this, and his brother Hod, who unwittingly killed him. The return of both these gods, the unjustly slain and the deceived perpetrator, serves as a cleaning of the slate. The inciting incident has become resolved, and there is no grudge to be held. They will live in the land where Asgard once stood, and will be joined by Modi and Magni, the sons of Thor, who carry Mjolnir, as well as Vidar, the god who avenged Odin, and Vali, the god who avenged Baldr by killing Hod. This is a further cleaning of that slate. The world is green and good, but the last lines of the seeress's prophecy provide an ominous vision of Nidhogg flying over the plains, carrying corpses in his claws. Is this worrying picture somehow related to Nastrandir? Is it a vision that precedes all of this? The poem can at times be read as nonlinear. Or is it proof that just as the world rose again, it can fall again? It's vague, but I like to think that this positions the destruction of the world as a cycle. Earlier on in the prophecy, we hear about these gold playthings that Baldr and Hod find upon their return. This callback, as well as Nidhogg's flight, can be seen as complementing an idea of a cycle of death, rebirth, an idea that can be found in many mythologies. But it's left vague, and I think purposefully so. As it says near the end of the Prose Edda, if you know how to ask questions reaching still further into the future, then I do not know the source of your questions, because I have never heard of anyone who could tell events of the world further into the future. So with Ragnarok finished, and the world reborn, We won't look forward, but behind, to the event that started this all. Join me tomorrow, when we'll look at Baldr's death.